Good morning. When I started writing this sermon in the middle of the week, this first line said, "It finally feels like spring." Of course, I wrote this on Wednesday, and then Friday came and the temperatures plummeted again. But on Wednesday, I was considering how these spring days even had a hint of summer in them, as we in our house pulled out window fans and hosed off porches, getting ready to move much of our indoor lives outdoors. And with spring, of course, comes planting. After what seemed like an interminable winter, Patrick and I finally got into the garden the other week to plant one of his garden boxes with all the vegetables of his choosing. Well, there's not much green there yet, because we weren't able to turn the ground as early as we liked, what with the winter cold, ignoring the calendar and persisting in its frosty bite well into April. Nevertheless, one sunny morning came, and we crouched beside a little 4-foot by 4-foot plot and awkwardly scattered in delicate carrot seeds, minuscule lettuce seeds, the perfectly circular, though diminutive seeds of cabbage. By the time we got to the peas, we breathed a sigh of relief. We were rather tired of picking through all the other tiny little seeds. Pea seeds are substantial. They have heft. They are large enough to be easily handled by the soft and still slightly pudgy hand of a 5-year-old, and don't try the patience of the more experienced gardener quite as much. It's easy to get one seed into one hole. As Patrick gently patted the soil over our final sowing, tucking the seeds in with a dirty blanket of compost and dirt, he gave them a sort of benediction. He said, "Okay, seeds, there you go. You can grow now." And after he vigorously watered them with perhaps a little too much enthusiasm, he wiped his brow in a strangely grown-up way, looked at me, and asked the question I'd been prepared to answer ever since Sebastian was little and helping us garden. He asked, "When will they grow?" Now, of course, he knew they wouldn't grow instantly. He'd been around enough spring times to know that. But he wasn't too keen on the estimated time I'd given him. He really didn't care about what the packet said about how many days to germination. Wasn't impressed with what our gardening book said about the days until harvest. He wanted to know, when will they grow? Well, I contemplated. I think we sort of woke up the seeds once we put them in the soil and covered them and watered them. They're waking up. Then in a few days, the seeds will start growing roots, and even a few more days, then maybe they'll start stretching towards the top of the dirt, and then in a few more days, so, he interrupts, they're growing now. Remembering that a 5-year-old doesn't really want the details of a 30-something-year-old's answer, I simply said, "Yeah, they're growing now." "Even though they're just still seeds?" he asked. "Yes, even though they're still seeds." When will they grow? We all want to know that. The letter to the Ephesians that we hear today, by tradition, is attributed to the Apostle Paul. The authorship is a matter of debate among scholars, however, but for purposes today, we are going to call the voice of the letter Paul. Paul is writing to the church at Ephesus, a multicultural and multi-ethnic congregation along the Ionian coast in Greece. It is suggested that this was written at the time when Paul the apostle was in prison in Rome, and in the midst of his situation, and in the midst of whatever terrible conflict is taking place in Ephesus, Paul writes words of encouragement that, to me, overshadows all the theological ramblings that take place after it. He says, "I do not cease to give thanks for you as I remember you in my prayers." Essentially, the voice of Paul says, "My prayers for you are persistent. Honestly, I'm more of a parable person than a Paul person. So hearing Paul's voice speaking these words remind me of some familiar parables of persistence in Matthew. Namely, the woman who takes a small amount of yeast and works it into 60 pounds of flour and works it through, and voila, bread. And I think of the parable of the mustard seed, in which the farmer puts the seed, the kind that falls in the crevices of your fingers. He puts them in the ground, and it becomes a huge plant. I've often heard interpretations of these parables focusing on the size of the yeast and the size of the seed. They're tiny. That this is what the kingdom of God is like. It is something that when it is planted, it is small, but it grows and becomes something that cannot be denied, must be contended with, is present and makes itself known in the world. That is the kingdom of God, a story of smallness to greatness. Yes, it's sort of a biblical success, rags to riches story, isn't it? And we love rags to riches stories. The parables give a sense that the kingdom of God goes from small to great in one fell swoop. That our prayers move from seed to feed instantly, yeast into the best tasting loaf of bread you've ever had. Just like that, we get caught up in the end result. But not spoken in this story, something we don't see happening in the parables but is inevitably there, is the farmer waiting day after day by his window, watching for the rain to come and nourish that mustard seed, or worrying about the birds stripping the seed from the soil, or shooing away the bunnies that descend to nibble the delicate leaves. We don't see in the parable of the yeast the woman waiting in those quiet moments while the yeasty smell of microscopic transformations take place in the flour. Bacteria feasting on sugars and wheat, slowly growing perhaps alongside the grumbles of the woman's belly. Just waiting and watching, feasting early on the smell of forthcoming goodness. We miss something in the parables if we discount the active waiting that is involved and is required. I grew up with the Arnold Lobel stories of Frog and Toad. Do any of you know those stories, Frog and Toad? And my children are growing up with these sweet stories of a languid frog named Frog and his plucky friend Toad, who is a toad. In one story called The Garden, Toad envies Frog's garden, and Frog gives Toad some seeds to plant to make his own garden. So Toad runs home and plants the seeds. And once they're in the ground, he stands there and sternly tells them, "Now seeds, start growing." Well, they do not cooperate. And he starts shouting at them to start growing. He laments to frogs that his seeds will not grow, to which Frog responds, and I'm reading from the story now. Frog says, "You're shouting too much. These poor seeds are afraid to grow." "My seeds are afraid to grow?" says Toad. "Of course," says Frog. "Leave them alone for a few days. Let the sun shine on them. Let the rain fall on them. Soon your seeds will start to grow." That night, Toad looked out of his window. "Drat," said Toad. "My seeds have not started to grow. They must be afraid of the dark." So Toad went out to his garden with some candles. "I will read the seeds a story," said Toad. "Then they will not be afraid." Toad read a long story to his seeds, and all the next day Toad sang songs to his seeds, and all the next day Toad read poems to his seeds, and all the next day Toad played music for his seeds. Toad looked at the ground, and the seeds still did not start to grow. "What shall I do?" cried Toad. These must be the most frightened seeds in the world." Then Toad felt very tired, and he fell asleep. "Toad, Toad, wake up," said Frog. "Look at your garden." Toad looked at his garden. Little green plants were coming up out of the ground. "At last," shouted Toad, "my seeds have stopped being afraid to grow." And Frog said, "I'm so happy that it's growing." And Toad said, "It is. But you're right, Frog. Gardening is a lot of hard work." When it comes to my own prayers, I stand in the garden, planting seeds like Toad, a garden already and full of potential, and for days, weeks, years even, it feels like I'm just looking at dirt. All potential, no produce. There are spiritual seeds within us and around us whose potential we see, but we just can't see the plants and produce sprouting up. And yet when we hear Paul exhort, and we hear Jesus emphasize through the parables, and we see Toad and Patrick painfully learning, is that even though the seed is under the ground and nothing seems to be coming from it, it will become. Our prayers, our transformations, our new creations will take time. I actually feel like I'm riding a bit on the coattails of Madeline's sermon, who shared something similar a few weeks ago. But let's consider that she planted the seeds, and now I'm just here to water them, to remind you. Because maybe now it feels like we must employ patience, and patience is one of the hardest virtues for me. The difficulty with patience is we feel we are simply waiting. And when we are simply waiting, we feel like we're not doing anything. Yes, waiting can be simply waiting, but it doesn't necessarily mean doing nothing or not engaging in any way. Let's learn from Toad. Once he realized he couldn't force his desires to become, he couldn't make the plants grow, he couldn't essentially bully his prayers into reality. When he realized he couldn't force these things to happen, he decided to move from waiting on them, and he decided to attend to them. He attended to them while they did the work they needed to do. And attend doesn't simply mean waiting and watching. To attend something means to grace something with your presence. And so Toad did. He sang to them. He spoke kindly to them. He read to them. He recited poetry. He played music for them. He hoped for them. He prayed for them and rested alongside them. And so Paul did. He actively contemplated and kept the people of Ephesus before him. And so Patrick does, as he daily goes to check to see if the seeds need water, standing attentively as the seeds grow. What would it mean for us to attend in this way to the spiritual seeds planted within us? The seeds of Christ's kingdom planted in this world. For many of us, in the face of gun violence and sexual harassment and duplicitous politicians and lone protesters who try to make us feel small, it feels like our thoughts and prayers can ring hollow. Because as Madeline said earlier, we wonder, what in the world can we do? We feel incapable, or we feel too small, or outnumbered, or too polite, or too timid, or too special. Our prayers are just like whispers in the wind, drowned out by persistent storms that are only getting stronger. Well, the letter of Paul implies to be a prayer, is not to just sit with our thoughts and prayers. It is constantly coming to terms with the realities that face us. It is doing our part by attending to the still small voice inside us that will cause those seeds to flourish. It is not giving up, but praying and attending constantly. We all know for Toad, it was just a matter of time, really, before the seeds sprouted, whether or not he did anything. The sun would warm, the rain would pour. Yes, the seeds would sprout, even if he sat and stared at them. But I like to think on how he was transformed by attending to his seeds, even when all he saw was just dirt. And imagine how we can be transformed when we attend to our prayers with attention and care and bravery and active waiting. How will we then, alongside our seeds, start to flourish? So as we go, prepare to wait, to attend, and flourish. We will go in the knowledge that God's attending to us is constant. So let us go into the world, prepared to live out our prayers. I invite you to rise and join together in our unison benediction. Please join with me. O gracious God, when you open your hand, you satisfy the desires of every living thing. Bless the land and waters. Give the world a plentiful harvest. Let your Spirit go forth to renew the face of the earth. Amen. Go in peace.